Within this video, we're going to talk about moving a pivot point of an object while you're inside of the Unreal Engine. Now, I would highly suggest doing this actually in whatever program you've been modeling this stuff in, but it is possible to do it here inside of Unreal. We're also going to cover how to do this in Unreal 5 and in 4, and we're also going to cover how to do this as a permanent and as a temporary. So if you want to move the pivot point on an object temporarily, it's actually pretty easy to do. So I'm going to go ahead and select this one because the pivot point is way off. And all you have to do is hold down the Alt key and middle mouse click and drag, and you can actually move the pivot point. And I can see I can snap it here because it's set to snap, which is also important. So if I don't want it to snap, let's go ahead and turn the snaps off and middle mouse click and drag it. There we go. So now I can go ahead and move this thing temporarily. So if I wanted to rotate it, it'll actually rotate from there. Now, what do I mean by temporary? You'll notice I just undid and it totally went somewhere else. And if I were to select something and come back, it's not where you want it to be. So that's not super helpful. Now, here's another thing that you can do as well. Let's go ahead and make a copy of this. I'm going to hold down Alt and click and drag and make a copy of this and just set it over here. Now, these are both instances, and I can actually change the pivot on each one of them temporarily or permanently too. So let's do this. So if I hold down Alt and I middle mouse click and drag and I move this over here, now what I'm going to do is right click on this and we'll find a spot that says pivot and then go ahead and say set as pivot offset. So now if I select one of these, and I select this one, you'll notice that it's right there. But if I grab another one of these from the content, you'll notice that its pivot is not in the right place. So I can temporarily kind of set this one up for this one, but this one only. So now let's go ahead and change the pivot point permanently on one of these objects. So to make a point, I'm going to go ahead and make a duplicate of this. I'm just going to slide this and set it right here. We'll see why this is going to be important in a minute. So to do this, we actually need to open up the modeling mode. So up here in the top left, we'll go to modeling mode and we'll come down in here into modeling. And we get all these tools. Specifically, the one that I'm looking for is this transform section, and the button I'm looking for is this pivot one right here. So with my object selected, I'm going to go ahead and click that pivot button. Now you can see I can move this pivot around. I can just grab these, kind of move them from place to place, no problem. So one of the things that might be helpful is actually to leave your snaps on if you know how big these objects are. Now I know this object is 300 units tall because I built it that way for a reason, and this is going to be important here in a minute. So let's go ahead and zoom in on this. And what I'm going to do is up here, I've got a couple of buttons. Now, if I go ahead and choose the center of this, what it does is it actually centers that pivot right in the dead center of the bounding box for this object. So let's go and do something like front. I'm like, okay, cool. But I really want this to be in the front on the bottom. And if I hit the bottom button, you'll see that it does the center of this object. I'm like, that may not be great for a pillar. This is probably fine, but it's not going to be great for this. So here's a little tricky trick. I'm going to go ahead and say front. And I know that this is 300 units tall. So if I set my snaps to 50, now as I move this, it'll go down 50, and now it's on the bottom front of this. Perfect. Now I know it's at the very bottom. We're good to go. But what if I want to put it on the corner? Well, I also might need to know how big this thing is. And I know that this one is actually 54 units by 54 units. So I'm looking at this right here, the approximate size. So if I were to go ahead and try and move this over, I may or may not be able to get it. So I can get pretty close if I actually change this to something like 1. But instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my view, and by hitting this little button, sorry I did that really quick, this one right here, so I can look at this thing from above. So with the object selected, I can hit F, and I'll be able to zoom in on it. And I'm going to zoom in down here. And if I grab this, I can kind of just slide this up. Let's actually turn the snaps totally off. Oh, it's going to fight me right now. There we go. And I can move this back. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just keep zooming in, and I'm going to use the little Gizmo arms to align them. So I can get this one aligned here and this one aligned here, and I'll know that where they meet is kind of where I want that pivot point to be. So this will give me a pretty close approximation. As mentioned before, I would highly suggest doing this in your DCC program. Cool. So now that I actually have it where I want it, I just need to hit the accept button down here. Now, when I do this, before I do it, watch this pillar over here. You'll notice that it changes too. Remember what I had mentioned before, that you're changing this one. So if there are any instances of this in your world, they will all update. So you want to get your pivot point right before you bring it actually into the program. So to change the pivot point permanently inside of Unreal 4, you may actually need to turn on a plugin if it isn't already turned on. So it's really easy. Just go up to Settings, go to Plugins, and do a search for Modeling. And you'll find Modeling Tools in Editor mode. Go ahead and enable that. You'll get a little pop-up that says, hey, by the way, this is in beta. So are you sure you want to do this? Go ahead and just say yes, that's fine. And then you'll get a little spot down here that says you'll need to restart the editor. So go ahead and do that. With that plugin now active, we can go ahead and select the object. And what I'm going to do is come up into the modes up here. Go ahead and choose the modeling down here at the very bottom. And you'll see that we have basically the same setup, but our tools are actually up here at the top instead. So we'll go into the Transform tab, which is right here. Go ahead and choose our Edit Pivot, which is right here. There we go. And you can see we have all of the same tools that we had before. And once you've actually got that set up, you'll notice that your Accept button is actually up here. So it's a few different places, but it's pretty much the same setup. And just like in Unreal 5, if I hold down the Alt and middle mouse, I can actually move it temporarily. And if I set it on this side, and I right click, I can actually come down here into Pivot. And you can see Set Pivot as Offset. And then that'll make it that permanent spot for this specific instance. So there you have it, a couple ways to actually change the pivot inside of the Unreal Engine on an object without having to leave out to another application.